Step out of the truck before I decide you stole it, the police officer said with a laugh that carried across the empty highway shoulder. The red and blue lights from the patrol car painted the rusted pickup truck in harsh flashes of color, turning the quiet stretch of asphalt into a stage of accusation. Marcus Reed kept both hands on the steering wheel exactly where the officer could see them. The old truck idled with a low, steady rumble, its engine sounding tired but dependable after a long day of work. A faint smell of motor oil clung to Marcus's jacket, the kind that never really washed out once it's soaked into fabric. Officer Daniel Briggs walked slowly around the front of the truck, shining his flashlight across the faded paint and dented bumper like he was inspecting a piece of junk at a scrapyard. His boots crunched against loose gravel. "Let me guess," Briggs said loudly enough for the passing cars to hear. "You borrowed this truck from someone who actually owns it." Marcus exhaled slowly and kept his voice calm. "Evening, officer. Is there a problem?" The officer leaned closer to the open window, his flashlight beam cutting across Marcus's face. For a moment, the only sounds were the humming engine and the distant rush of traffic moving at 65 miles per hour down the highway. The passenger door remained closed. Whoever sat there had not moved or spoken since the flashing lights first appeared behind them a minute earlier. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Officer Briggs tapped the flashlight against the door of the truck. The metal gave a hollow clank that echoed into the quiet night air. "Problem?" he repeated with a smirk. "The problem is this pile of metal you're driving through my district." He straightened and looked over the truck again, shaking his head slowly as if the sight offended him. Marcus Reed had driven that truck for more than 10 years. It had carried lumber, tools, and spare engines across half the county. The paint was faded and the driver's side mirror had a crack running through the corner, but the engine was strong and the tires were new. Tonight, Marcus had been heading home after helping someone stranded on the side of the road, a simple favor that had taken longer than expected. The dashboard clock glowed softly, showing that it was already past 9 in the evening. Briggs leaned down again, lowering his voice in a tone that sounded almost amused. "You know something funny?" he said. "Every time I see a truck like this after dark, there's always a story behind it." His flashlight shifted toward the passenger seat for the first time, the beam briefly catching the polished toe of a dress shoe resting quietly on the floor mat. The officer paused, then lifted the light slightly higher toward the shadowed figure sitting beside Marcus. Whoever it was had remained completely silent since the stop began, hands folded calmly in their lap, as if they were waiting for something to happen. Officer Briggs frowned slightly, curiosity replacing the smirk on his face for the first time. "And who exactly is riding with you tonight?" he asked slowly, unaware that the answer to that question was about to change the entire night. Officer Daniel Briggs narrowed his eyes at the shadowed passenger seat, the beam of his flashlight lingering on the polished dress shoe for several seconds before sliding slowly upward. The figure sitting there did not move. The light revealed the edge of a dark coat, neatly pressed, resting calmly against the seat. Whoever the passenger was, they sat with the quiet stillness of someone who had no intention of being rushed. Briggs tilted his head slightly and gave a short laugh under his breath, the kind that carried more suspicion than humor. "So you brought company," he said, straightening his back and stepping away from the window. The red and blue lights continued to flash across the truck and the empty stretch of highway shoulder, painting the scene in restless waves of color. Marcus Reed remained seated behind the wheel, hands still resting on the steering wheel exactly where the officer could see them. The engine of the old pickup continued its steady rumble, the vibration faintly shaking the worn dashboard. Marcus spoke calmly without turning his head. "Officer, we were just heading home." Briggs ignored the answer. He moved toward the passenger side of the truck, boots crunching across the gravel with slow, deliberate steps. The beam of the flashlight bounced along the side of the truck, revealing every scratch and dent in the faded paint. A passing sedan rushed by in the far lane, its headlights sweeping across the roadside for a brief second before disappearing into the darkness. Briggs stopped beside the passenger door and tapped the metal twice with the end of his flashlight. The hollow sound echoed in the quiet night air. "You heard the question," he said loudly. "Who is riding with you tonight?" The passenger remained silent. Marcus glanced briefly toward the door, but kept his posture steady. The moment stretched longer than Briggs expected. The officer shifted his weight and leaned closer to the glass, trying to peer through the reflection of his own flashing lights. He could see the outline of a man sitting upright in the seat, shoulders relaxed, hands folded calmly in his lap. The calmness seemed to irritate him more than anything else. Briggs lifted the flashlight again and shined it directly through the window. The beam reflected off the glass and briefly illuminated a silver watch resting against the passenger's wrist. It was the kind of watch that did not belong in a rusted pickup truck. Briggs frowned slightly. His voice hardened. "Step out of the vehicle," he said. Marcus did not move. His voice remained quiet but firm. "Officer, there is no reason for that." The words hung in the air for a moment. Briggs took a step backward and placed one hand on his belt. The flashing lights from the patrol car reflected off the chrome badge on his chest. "No reason," he repeated slowly. "I decide the reason." Another vehicle passed on the highway, the rush of wind briefly rattling the loose mirror on the side of the truck. The passenger inside finally shifted slightly, the faint movement of a shoulder visible in the dim light. Briggs noticed immediately. "That is it," he said, raising his voice. "Passenger, open the door and step out where I can see you." The interior of the truck remained quiet. Marcus Reed closed his eyes for a brief second, then opened them again. He knew exactly how this moment usually ended. He had seen it before on roads like this, under lights like these, with officers who looked at a man in an old truck and already believed they knew the entire story. But tonight was different. Marcus turned his head slightly toward the passenger seat and spoke in a calm voice that carried just enough warning to be noticed. "Sir," he said quietly, "you might want to stay seated." Officer Briggs heard the word and frowned. "Sir," he repeated with a mocking smile. "Listen to that." He leaned closer to the door again and rapped the flashlight harder against the metal. "Passenger," he barked. "You heard me. Step out of the vehicle now." Inside the truck, the passenger slowly lifted one hand and adjusted the cuff of his coat. The movement was small but deliberate, like someone preparing to stand in front of a room. Outside the truck, the officer waited with growing impatience, unaware that the next few seconds were about to turn a routine traffic stop into a moment that would follow him long after the flashing lights faded into the night. Inside the truck, the movement of the passenger's hand was slow and deliberate, the quiet gesture of someone who had spent many years learning that calm could be more powerful than anger. The cuff of the dark coat settled neatly back against his wrist as he finished adjusting it. Outside, Officer Daniel Briggs stood beside the passenger door with growing impatience, the beam of his flashlight cutting across the window again and again as if he expected the light itself to force the man inside to obey. The flashing patrol lights continued to pulse across the roadside, painting the gravel shoulder in restless colors while the distant highway traffic hummed like a low river of sound in the night. Marcus Reed kept both hands resting on the steering wheel. His fingers were steady, though his eyes watched the officer through the side mirror. He had seen situations like this unfold before. He knew the tone of the officer's voice, the tightening jaw, the confidence of a man who believed the uniform on his chest meant he could control every moment of the night. Briggs tapped the passenger door again, louder this time. The hollow metal sound echoed against the dark fields surrounding the road. "Passenger," he repeated, each word sharper than the last. "You either step out right now, or I open this door myself." The passenger inside the truck remained still for another second, as if considering the demand. The faint reflection of the patrol lights danced across the polished surface of his watch. Marcus spoke quietly without turning his head. "Officer," he said, his voice careful and calm, "there really is no need to push this any further." Briggs laughed, a short, humorless sound that vanished quickly in the open night air. "You do not get to decide that," he replied. His hand moved to the door handle. The metal clicked as he tested it, but the door remained closed. Briggs stepped back slightly and aimed the flashlight directly into the window again. The light revealed more of the passenger now. A dark coat, carefully pressed. A clean white shirt collar. A posture so relaxed that it almost seemed out of place inside a truck whose dashboard carried the scratches and dust of years of work. Briggs frowned again. Something about the calm presence inside the seat did not match the story he had already built in his head. "You hiding something in there?" he asked, glancing back toward Marcus with narrowed eyes. Marcus exhaled slowly through his nose. "No, sir," he answered. "Nothing like that." Another vehicle sped past on the highway, the rush of wind shaking the loose mirror on the side of the truck and sending a ripple through the tall grass along the roadside ditch. For a brief moment, the headlights of the passing car illuminated the interior of the pickup through the rear window. The light revealed the passenger's face just enough to show a composed expression and steady eyes watching the officer through the glass. Briggs noticed the movement immediately. His posture stiffened. He stepped closer again, the beam of the flashlight rising until it reached the man's face directly. The passenger did not shield his eyes or look away. He simply watched the officer with a quiet patience that felt almost deliberate. Briggs lowered the flashlight slightly, confused by the reaction. Most passengers in situations like this avoided eye contact or shifted nervously in their seats. This man did neither. Instead, he reached calmly toward the seat belt that crossed his chest. The faint click of the buckle releasing sounded inside the quiet cabin of the truck. Outside, Officer Briggs lifted his chin with a smug expression, clearly believing that the silence was finally ending in obedience. "That is more like it," he said. "Go ahead and open the door." Marcus Reed watched the movement from the corner of his eye. His grip tightened on the steering wheel for just a moment before he relaxed again. He had offered the warning already. What happened next would no longer be his decision. Inside the truck, the passenger reached for the door handle, his movements unhurried, almost thoughtful, as though he understood that the moment waiting on the other side of that door was about to reveal far more than the officer standing outside expected. The faint click of the door handle turning inside the truck seemed louder than the traffic rushing along the highway. Officer Daniel Briggs watched closely, his flashlight beamed steady against the passenger window. The flashing patrol lights painted the truck in restless waves of red and blue, while the night air carried the distant hum of tires rolling across asphalt at 65 miles per hour. Inside the cabin, the passenger paused for a brief moment before opening the door, as if measuring the patience of the man standing outside. Marcus Reed felt the vibration of the engine through the steering wheel and kept his eyes forward, though every sense told him the moment had reached a point where things could no longer return to normal. Briggs shifted his stance beside the door and rested one hand against his belt, the confident posture of a man who believed he had complete control over the situation. "Go ahead," he said with a short nod. "Step out nice and slow." The passenger finally pushed the door open. The hinges creaked softly as the door swung outward into the flashing lights. For a second, the interior of the truck was fully illuminated by the patrol car behind them. A polished leather shoe touched the gravel shoulder first, steady and deliberate. Then the passenger stepped down from the seat and straightened to his full height beside the truck. The dark coat settled across his shoulders as he adjusted it with one smooth motion, the movement calm and practiced. Officer Briggs lowered his flashlight slightly as he studied the man standing in front of him. He had expected hesitation, maybe nervousness, the awkward body language of someone caught in a routine stop. Instead, he saw a composed, middle-aged man with calm eyes and a posture that carried quiet confidence. The man brushed a small piece of dust from the sleeve of his coat, then looked directly at the officer. The silence between them stretched for a few seconds while the flashing lights continued their slow rhythm across the roadside. Briggs cleared his throat and lifted his chin again, returning to the authority in his voice. "Identification," he said firmly. The passenger did not immediately reach for a wallet or pocket. Instead, he glanced briefly toward Marcus Reed, who still sat quietly behind the steering wheel with both hands visible. Marcus gave the slightest nod, a silent acknowledgement that the moment had arrived exactly as he expected. The passenger then turned his attention back to Officer Briggs. "Officer," he said in a calm voice that carried easily over the low rumble of the truck engine, "was there a reason for stopping this vehicle tonight?" Briggs frowned slightly at the question. Most people answer requests during a traffic stop, not ask questions of their own. He lifted the flashlight again and angled it toward the man's face. The beam revealed sharp features and steady eyes that did not flinch under the light. "I asked for identification," Briggs repeated, his tone less patient now. The man studied the officer for a moment, then slowly reached into the inside pocket of his coat. The movement was deliberate and careful, exactly the way a person would move when standing beside an armed officer on a dark highway. Briggs watched closely, ready to react if necessary, though the calm demeanor of the man continued to unsettle him in a way he could not quite explain. The passenger withdrew a small leather wallet and opened it briefly before holding it toward the flashlight beam. The officer leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the identification card inside. The light reflected across the badge-shaped seal printed at the top of the card, then across the name printed beneath it. For a moment, Briggs did not speak. The wind from another passing car rustled the tall grass along the roadside, while the patrol lights continued flashing behind him. The officer blinked once, then looked up from the car to the man standing in front of him, his expression slowly shifting from irritation to confusion as the realization began to settle in that the quiet passenger from the old pickup truck was not the kind of man he had expected to meet on the side of a dark highway. Officer Daniel Briggs kept his eyes on the identification card for a few seconds longer than he intended, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand as the patrol lights continued flashing behind him. The small leather wallet remained open in the passenger's steady hand, the identification resting clearly in the light. The seal at the top of the card reflected a faint glimmer, while the printed name beneath, it seemed to sit heavier in Briggs's mind with every passing second. The wind from the highway pushed gently across the roadside, carrying the low roar of engines and the faint smell of warm asphalt. Marcus Reed watched through the side mirror from inside the truck, his face calm, though his eyes followed every movement outside. He had already seen the shift in the officer's posture. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Officer Briggs blinked once more and lowered the flashlight slightly, then raised it again as if hoping the name might somehow change if he looked twice. It did not. The man standing in front of him remained composed, the same quiet patience in his expression as he waited for the officer to finish reading. Finally, Briggs cleared his throat. "You expect me to believe this," he said slowly, his voice carrying a sharp edge of disbelief. The passenger did not move the wallet. "Believe what, officer?" he asked calmly. Briggs looked up from the identification and studied the man's face again. The steady gaze, the confident posture, the quiet way he carried himself beside the old truck. None of it matched the story Briggs had built in his head the moment he saw the rusted pickup pulled onto the shoulder. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You riding around in a truck like this," he said, gesturing toward the worn vehicle beside them. "And this card says you're the mayor of this city." The passenger finally closed the wallet and slipped it back into the inside pocket of his coat. "That card says exactly what it says," he replied calmly. The officer shook his head, his frustration returning quickly as the patrol lights flickered across his uniform. "You think I have not seen fake identification before," he said. "People try things like this all the time." Inside the truck, Marcus Reed let out a slow breath through his nose. He kept his hands resting on the steering wheel, the old engine still rumbling steadily beneath the hood. The scene unfolding outside was not surprising to him. What surprised him was how quickly the officer had chosen the story he wanted to believe. The passenger remained where he stood beside the truck, his hands relaxed at his sides. "Officer Briggs," he said quietly. The sound of his name made the officer pause. Briggs narrowed his eyes. "How do you know my name?" The man nodded slightly toward the badge shining on the officer's chest. "It is written clearly," he said. Briggs glanced down for a moment before straightening again, his jaw tightening as he realized the answer had been obvious. The passenger continued speaking in the same calm voice. "I understand that this truck may not look impressive," he said. But Marcus Reed helped me tonight when my own car broke down about 12 miles north of here. Briggs looked toward the driver's seat again, the beam of the flashlight briefly crossing Marcus's face. You expect me to believe that too, he muttered. Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady and respectful. My repair shop sits right off County Road 22, officer. I was closing up when I saw him, standing beside the road. His vehicle had a dead battery, and the towing service told him it would take over an hour. Briggs shifted his weight on the gravel shoulder, clearly irritated by the calm explanations. The flashing patrol lights reflected off the chrome trim of the truck as another car sped past on the highway. The passenger looked toward Marcus briefly, then back to the officer. Marcus offered to drive me back into town so I could reach my office, he said. That is all. Briggs stared at both men for a moment. His expression caught somewhere between suspicion and uncertainty. The quiet roadside, the flashing lights, the steady rumble of the old truck engine. Everything about the scene felt strangely balanced on a single fragile moment. And Officer Daniel Briggs still had not decided whether the identification card he had just read represented the truth he was standing in front of or the mistake he was about to make. Officer Daniel Briggs stood in the flashing lights with the uneasy feeling that the ground beneath his assumptions had shifted slightly, though he refused to admit it even to himself. The wind from another passing vehicle swept across the shoulder of the highway and rustled the tall grass beside the ditch, carrying with it the distant hum of engines moving through the dark. Briggs kept the flashlight trained on the passenger for another moment before lowering it slowly. His jaw tightened as he studied the man again. The calm expression, the neat coat, the quiet patience. None of it fit the picture he had built when he first saw the old truck pulled to the side of the road. The officer took a slow step backward and rested both hands on his belt. You expect me to believe that the mayor of this city is riding around after dark in a truck that looks like it came out of a junkyard, he said, the edge of disbelief still strong in his voice. The passenger did not react to the insult directed at the truck. He simply stood beside the open door with the steady posture of someone who had spent many years learning how to let another person speak themselves into a corner. Marcus Reed remained behind the wheel with both hands visible, his eyes following the exchange through the side mirror. The old engine continued its quiet rumble beneath the hood, a low, steady sound that seemed almost peaceful compared with the tension building outside the door. The passenger spoke again with the same calm tone. Officer Briggs, I do not believe the condition of a vehicle determines the character of the man driving it. The words hung in air between them. Briggs narrowed his eyes. Character has nothing to do with it, he replied quickly. I stopped this vehicle because it looked suspicious. Marcus finally turned his head slightly toward the officer. Suspicious how? He asked quietly. The officer hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. Old truck. Late hour. 2 men riding around on a dark highway. The explanation sounded weaker the moment it left his mouth, but he pushed forward anyway. The passenger glanced briefly toward the road where another car passed at 65 miles per hour, its headlights sweeping across the shoulder before disappearing into the darkness again. Then he looked back at the officer. So you stopped us because the truck is old, he said calmly. Briggs folded his arms across his chest. That truck barely looks safe to drive, he said. And now I find out the driver claims he picked up a stranded mayor on the side of the road. Marcus gave a small, quiet sigh. I do not claim anything, he said. That is exactly what happened. Briggs turned toward him again, irritation rising. You keep quiet unless I ask you a question. Marcus nodded once and looked forward again without another word. The passenger watched the exchange carefully. His expression did not change, but his voice carried a slightly firmer tone when he spoke next. Officer Briggs, he said, Marcus Reed helped me when he had no reason to stop. My car is still sitting 12 miles north of here waiting for a tow truck that may not arrive for another 40 minutes. The officer shook his head slowly. That still does not explain why someone with your title would be riding in a truck like this. The passenger gave the faintest smile, though there was no amusement in it. Perhaps because the truck belongs to a good man who offered help when I needed it, he replied. The flashing lights from the patrol car reflected across the side of the pickup as another gust of wind swept across the open fields beside the road. Officer Briggs shifted his stance again, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. For a long moment, he said nothing, staring at the two men as though trying to force the scene to return to the version he preferred. But the quiet confidence of the passenger and the steady calm of Marcus Reed were slowly reshaping the moment into something he could no longer control as easily as he had expected. Officer Daniel Briggs shifted his weight again on the gravel shoulder, the crunch beneath his boots sounding louder now in the uneasy silence between the three men. The patrol lights behind him continued to pulse across the dark roadside, painting the old truck in flashes of red and blue that seemed almost restless against the quiet night. Briggs looked from the passenger to Marcus Reed and back again, his jaw tight as he struggled to hold onto the authority he believed belonged to him. The calm presence of the man standing beside the open truck door unsettled him in a way he did not want to admit. The passenger had not raised his voice once. He had not argued or protested. He had simply spoken with the quiet certainty of someone who did not need to prove who he was. Briggs exhaled sharply through his nose and glanced toward the patrol car as though considering his next move. Then he reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder. The small device crackled faintly as he pressed the button. "Dispatch," he said, his voice steady though a thin thread of irritation still lingered beneath it. "Run an identification check for a possible impersonation." Marcus Reed watched through the mirror as the officer spoke into the radio. The word impersonation hung in the air like a small spark drifting toward dry grass. The passenger remained still beside the truck, his hands resting calmly at his sides while the wind from the highway stirred the edge of his coat. "Name," Briggs continued into the radio, reading carefully from memory. "Jonathan Clark." The name echoed faintly in the quiet night. Marcus lowered his eyes briefly, though he said nothing. The passenger did not interrupt. He simply watched the officer with a patient expression that seemed to carry both understanding and quiet disappointment. A moment later the radio responded with a burst of static followed by a distant voice. Briggs listened closely, though his face revealed nothing yet. "Repeat that," he said into the radio after a few seconds. The wind rustled the grass again, while another vehicle passed on the highway, its headlights sweeping across the roadside and briefly illuminating the three figures standing beside the truck. The response from dispatch came again through the speaker. This time Briggs did not interrupt. His posture stiffened slightly as he listened to the full message. When the voice on the radio finished, the officer lowered his hand slowly. For several seconds, he said nothing. Marcus Reed could see the tension building in the officer's shoulders even from the driver's seat. The passenger remained quiet, though his eyes never left the officer's face. Finally, Briggs cleared his throat. "Dispatch confirms that name belongs to the mayor," he said slowly, though the words carried more reluctance than certainty. He looked at the passenger again, his expression caught somewhere between stubborn pride and growing doubt. "But that does not mean you are him," he added quickly. The passenger nodded slightly, as if he had expected that answer. "You are correct," he said calmly. "A name alone proves very little." Briggs gestured toward the truck again, his frustration returning. "Exactly," he said. "So let us not pretend that this situation makes sense." Marcus lifted his eyes toward the officer again. His voice remained respectful, but firm. "Officer Briggs," he said quietly, "sometimes things that do not make sense at first still turn out to be true." Briggs ignored the comment and stepped a little closer to the passenger. The flashing patrol lights reflected in the man's eyes for a brief moment before fading again into shadow. The officer studied him carefully now, as if searching for any small detail that might expose the lie he still wanted to believe existed. But the calm posture, the measured breathing, and the steady gaze remained unchanged. The passenger spoke again after a moment. "You have every right to verify who I am," he said, "but I would suggest that you consider how this conversation began." Briggs frowned slightly at that remark, though he did not respond immediately. The quiet road, the flashing lights, and the steady rumble of the old truck engine surrounded them like a silent audience. For the first time since the traffic stop began, Officer Daniel Briggs began to feel the uncomfortable possibility that the moment unfolding beside this worn pickup truck might not end the way he expected when he first stepped out of his patrol car. Officer Daniel Briggs stood beside the open truck door with the radio still resting in his hand, the faint static from the device fading into the quiet hum of the highway. The flashing patrol lights continued to wash the scene in restless colors while the cool night air drifted across the gravel shoulder. For several long seconds no one spoke. The word from dispatch still echoed in Briggs's mind, confirming the name he had heard, yet refusing to settle the doubt that pride continued to push forward. Marcus Reed remained behind the wheel, his hands resting calmly on the steering wheel as the old engine idled with its steady low vibration. He watched the officer through the mirror, recognizing the tension in the man's posture. The passenger stood beside the truck with the quiet patience that had marked every moment since he stepped out of the vehicle. His coat moved slightly in the wind, while his eyes remained fixed calmly on Officer Briggs. The officer finally lowered the radio to his side and took a slow step closer. "Dispatch confirms the name," he said, though the words sounded more like an argument than an acknowledgement. "But I still have not seen proof that you are actually him." The passenger nodded once. "That is fair," he said quietly. Briggs lifted his flashlight again, letting the beam settle briefly across the man's face before lowering it once more. "Because right now," he continued, "what I see is a man standing beside a truck that barely looks roadworthy, telling me a story that does not make sense." Marcus Reed spoke again from the driver's seat, his voice calm and measured. "Officer Briggs, the truck may not look impressive, but it runs just fine." Briggs shot him a sharp glance. "I did not ask for your opinion." Marcus nodded slightly and returned his gaze forward without another word. The passenger watched the exchange carefully, the same quiet disappointment returning to his expression. The wind shifted again across the open field beyond the roadside ditch, carrying with it the distant sound of another vehicle approaching along the highway. Its headlights appeared briefly in the distance before passing them at 65 miles per hour and vanishing again into the darkness. The passenger spoke again after the sound faded. "Officer Briggs," he said calmly, "you are doing your job by verifying a situation that seems unusual. That is understandable." The officer folded his arms across his chest. "Then you understand why this is not over yet," he replied. The passenger nodded once more. "Of course." He reached slowly toward the inside pocket of his coat again. The movement immediately drew Briggs's attention. The officer's hand moved instinctively toward his belt as he watched closely. The passenger paused slightly, then spoke before continuing the motion. "I'm going to take out my phone," he said. Briggs gave a stiff nod, though his eyes remained cautious. The passenger withdrew a sleek black phone and unlocked the screen with a simple movement of his thumb. The bright glow of the display briefly illuminated his face in the darkness. He tapped the screen twice and turned the phone toward the officer. The image displayed was clear even in the flashing patrol lights. It showed the same man standing beside the governor during a press conference earlier that week, microphones and cameras filling the background. The headline beneath the photograph identified him clearly as Jonathan Clark, mayor of the city. Briggs stared at the image longer than he expected. The light from the screen reflected faintly in his eyes, while the distant highway noise continued to drift through the night air. Slowly, the officer lifted his gaze from the phone back to the man standing in front of him. The calm posture, the steady voice, the same face now matching the image on the screen. For the first time since the stop began, the certainty in Officer Daniel Briggs's expression began to weaken. Yet pride still held him in place. He exhaled slowly through his nose and shook his head once. "Pictures can be edited," he muttered. The passenger lowered the phone again and slipped it back into his pocket without arguing. Marcus Reed watched quietly from the driver's seat, the faint glow of the dashboard lights reflecting in his eyes. The moment had stretched far beyond a simple traffic stop now, and though Officer Briggs had not yet admitted it aloud, the quiet truth of the situation had already begun to close around him like the slow tightening of a door he could no longer stop from swinging shut. Officer Daniel Briggs stood in the flashing patrol lights with the uncomfortable weight of silence pressing down on the roadside. The wind carried the distant hum of traffic along the highway, while the old pickup truck continued its steady rumble beside him. Marcus Reed remained behind the wheel, his hands resting calmly on the steering wheel exactly where the officer could see them. The passenger, Jonathan Clark, stood beside the open door with quiet patience, the same composed expression that had never changed since the moment he stepped out of the truck. Briggs looked at him again, studying every detail as if he were trying to force the situation to match the version he had first imagined when the rusty truck pulled onto the shoulder. The worn paint, the cracked mirror, the driver in oil-stained work clothes. Everything about the scene had told him a story before he ever asked a question. And now that story was slowly collapsing in front of him. The officer shifted his stance on the gravel shoulder and glanced briefly toward the patrol car behind him. The radio still hung from his shoulder, silent now after the confirmation from dispatch. The red and blue lights continued to pulse across the road and the tall grass beside the ditch. Briggs finally spoke again, though his voice carried less confidence than before. "You understand how strange this looks," he said, gesturing toward the truck. Jonathan Clark nodded calmly. "I do," he replied. The officer frowned slightly. "Because if you're actually the mayor," Briggs continued, "then this is not the kind of vehicle I would expect you to be riding in after dark." Marcus Reed let out a quiet breath through his nose, though he said nothing. The passenger glanced briefly toward Marcus before answering. "Officer Briggs," he said calmly, "the kind of vehicle a man rides in does not change the truth of who he is." Briggs rubbed a hand across the back of his neck, as if the conversation had become more complicated than he expected. Another car rushed past on the highway at 65 miles per hour, the wind from its movement rippling across the roadside grass. For a moment, the headlights illuminated the three men standing beside the old pickup truck before fading into the distance again. Briggs watched the fading light and then looked back at Jonathan Clark. "You said your car broke down 12 miles north of here," he said slowly. "That is correct," the passenger answered, "on the shoulder near the old bridge crossing." The officer hesitated before speaking again. "What kind of car was it?" Jonathan Clark answered without pause. "A black sedan issued through the city motor pool." Briggs narrowed his eyes slightly. The answer sounded specific, too specific to dismiss easily. He glanced again at Marcus Reed sitting behind the wheel. The mechanic met his gaze calmly in the mirror. Briggs felt a quiet frustration building inside him. Not because the story failed to make sense anymore, but because it was beginning to make too much sense. He stepped closer to the truck and looked again at the worn interior through the open door. The dashboard carried the scratches and dust of years of work. A set of tools rested on the passenger floorboard. Nothing about the vehicle suggested deception or careful staging. It looked exactly like what it was. A working man's truck. Briggs straightened again and looked toward Jonathan Clark. For the first time since the stop began, the officer's voice carried a trace of hesitation. "If you really are who you say you are," he said slowly, "then I suppose someone from city security would already know where you are tonight." Jonathan Clark gave a small nod. "They do," he said. Briggs frowned. "Then why has no one come?" "Looking for you." The passenger looked briefly toward the quiet road, stretching into the darkness before answering. "Because when my car broke down, I told them not to send anyone," he said calmly. "Marcus Reed had already offered me a ride into town." The officer stared at him for several seconds, the explanation settling slowly into place. The quiet roadside, the old truck, the calm driver who had stopped to help a stranger. The pieces of the story now aligned in a way that left very little room for doubt. And as Officer Daniel Briggs stood beneath the flashing patrol lights, he began to realize that the moment he first stepped out of his patrol car, the assumptions he carried with him had already placed him on the wrong side of the truth. Officer Daniel Briggs stood beside the old pickup truck as the flashing patrol lights continued to pulse across the empty highway shoulder. And for the first time since the stop began, he felt the quiet pressure of realization settling heavily in his chest. The wind moved slowly across the open field beside the road, bending the tall grass, and carrying with it the steady rush of vehicles traveling 65 miles per hour through the darkness. Marcus Reed remained seated behind the wheel with both hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, his posture relaxed but attentive. The engine of the truck continued its deep, steady rumble beneath the hood, a sound that now felt almost grounding compared to the tension that had filled the roadside moments earlier. Jonathan Clark stood beside the open passenger door, his coat shifting slightly in the cool night air while his eyes remained steady on the officer. The calm patience in his expression had never changed. Briggs lowered his flashlight completely now, letting it hang loosely in his hand as he looked between the two men. The certainty he carried when he first approached the truck had faded into something quieter and far less comfortable. For a long moment, he said nothing. The flashing lights reflected off the chrome of his badge and across the side of the worn pickup truck, turning the scene into a restless pattern of color and shadow. Finally, the officer drew in a slow breath. "Mr. Clark," he said, the words coming out more carefully than before. The use of the name hung in the air, like a quiet admission that the story he had resisted was no longer easy to dismiss. Jonathan Clark nodded slightly. "Yes, officer." Briggs looked down briefly at the gravel beneath his boots before raising his eyes again. "If your vehicle really is 12 miles north near the bridge crossing," he said slowly, "then we can have a patrol unit check the location." Jonathan Clark gave a small nod. "That would be helpful," he replied calmly. Marcus Reed watched the exchange quietly through the mirror. The tension that had filled the roadside minutes earlier had begun to shift, though the silence that followed carried a different kind of weight. Briggs lifted the radio from his shoulder again and pressed the button. His voice sounded steadier now, though the sharp edge that had marked his earlier commands was gone. "Dispatch," he said. "Send a unit to the old bridge crossing 12 miles north of mile marker 34. Possible disabled city vehicle on the shoulder." The radio crackled with a short confirmation before falling silent again. Briggs lowered his hand and looked once more at the truck. In the flashing lights, the faded paint and dented bumper no longer looked suspicious. They simply looked worn from years of honest work. He glanced toward Marcus Reed sitting behind the wheel. For the first time, he studied the mechanic carefully instead of seeing only the truck around him. Oil stains marked the sleeves of Marcus's jacket, and his hands carried the rough texture of someone who worked with tools every day. Yet the calm composure in the man's face had never wavered, even when the stop had grown tense. Briggs cleared his throat again. "You said you run a repair shop," he said. Marcus nodded once. "Yes, sir. Right off County Road 22. The officer shifted his stance slightly. "And you stopped to help him on the road." Marcus answered simply. "Anyone would have done the same." Jonathan Clark looked toward Marcus with quiet appreciation before turning back to the officer. The flashing patrol lights continued their steady rhythm, while the highway carried the endless stream of distant engines into the night. Briggs stood there for several seconds longer, the weight of the moment settling deeper as he realized how easily the situation could have unfolded very differently. The assumptions he had made when he first saw the old truck had guided every word and action that followed. Now, those assumptions stood exposed beneath the harsh, flashing lights of his own patrol car. The quiet roadside held the three men in a fragile stillness as Officer Daniel Briggs slowly began to understand that the true test of authority was not how loudly it could be used, but how honestly a man could face the moment when he realized he had been wrong. Officer Daniel Briggs remained standing beside the truck long after his radio transmission ended, the quiet crackle of the device fading into the endless rhythm of traffic moving through the night. The flashing patrol lights continued to sweep across the road, the gravel shoulder, and the worn body of Marcus Reed's truck, but the tension that once filled the roadside had shifted into something heavier and more reflective. The wind carried the distant hum of engines while the tall grass beside the ditch moved gently under the cool air. Marcus Reed still sat behind the wheel, his hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, his posture unchanged from the moment the officer had first approached the vehicle. The engine of the truck rumbled steadily beneath the hood, the familiar sound of a working machine that had carried its owner through years of long days and late nights. Jonathan Clark stood beside the open passenger door, his coat resting neatly over his shoulders as he watched the officer with a quiet and thoughtful expression. Officer Briggs finally looked up again, his eyes moving slowly between the two men as though he were seeing them clearly for the first time. The assumptions that had shaped his earlier words now seemed embarrassingly loud in his own memory. The worn truck, the oil stains on Marcus's jacket, the calm voice that had tried to keep the situation from escalating. Every detail he had judged too quickly now carried a different meaning. Briggs took a slow breath and stepped closer to the truck. The crunch of gravel beneath his boots sounded almost hesitant now. When he spoke again, his voice no longer carried the sharp authority it had at the beginning of the stop. "Mr. Clark," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." The words settled into the night air with surprising weight. Marcus Reed lifted his eyes slightly toward the mirror but remained silent. Jonathan Clark watched the officer for a moment before answering. "For what exactly, officer?" he asked calmly. Briggs lowered his gaze briefly before looking back up again. "For the way this stop began," he said, "and for the assumptions I made when I saw this truck." The flashing patrol lights continued their steady rhythm behind him as he spoke. "I should have asked questions first instead of deciding what the answers were going to be." Jonathan Clark listened without interrupting. The quiet patience in his expression remained, though there was now a faint understanding in his eyes. Briggs turned slightly toward Marcus Reed, sitting behind the wheel. "And Mr. Reed," he added, "I owe you the same apology." Marcus looked toward the officer through the open window. His voice remained calm and respectful. "Officer Briggs, I understand that you were doing your job." Briggs shook his head slowly. "Doing my job does not mean forgetting how to treat people," he replied. The honesty in his voice carried more weight than any order he had spoken earlier that night. Jonathan Clark nodded slightly at that remark. "That is true," he said. The wind shifted again across the roadside as another vehicle passed on the highway, its headlights briefly illuminating the scene before fading into the distance. Briggs looked down the road for a moment before turning back toward the two men. "Dispatch should have a patrol unit at your vehicle soon," he said to Jonathan Clark. "Once they confirm it belongs to the city motor pool, they will arrange a tow and secure it." Clark nodded in acknowledgement. "Thank you, officer." Briggs glanced once more at Marcus Reed's truck. The faded paint and dented bumper now seemed almost symbolic of a lesson unfolding beneath the flashing lights. "Mr. Reed," he said quietly, "you did a good thing stopping to help someone on the side of the road tonight." Marcus gave a small nod. Anyone would have done the same. Jonathan Clark looked at him again with a faint smile. "Not everyone," he said softly. The roadside fell quiet once more, the flashing lights still moving across the night as Officer Daniel Briggs stood beside the old truck, realizing that the most important moment of the entire stop had not been the discovery of who the passenger was, but the realization of how easily a man could misjudge another person when he allowed appearances to speak louder than truth. The flashing patrol lights continued to sweep across the quiet highway shoulder as the tension that once filled the night slowly gave way to a calmer stillness. Officer Daniel Briggs stood beside the old pickup truck, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but thoughtful, almost reflective. The wind moved gently across the roadside fields while distant vehicles passed along the highway at 65 miles per hour, their headlights briefly illuminating the scene before fading again into the darkness. Marcus Reed remained seated behind the wheel of his truck, his hands still resting loosely on the steering wheel as the engine idled with a steady, familiar rumble. Years of work had left small scratches across the dashboard and dust along the worn floorboards, but the truck felt solid and dependable, much like the man who owned it. Jonathan Clark stood beside the open passenger door, his coat resting neatly across his shoulders while he looked toward Officer Briggs with a calm and measured expression. The quiet moment between them seemed to carry more meaning than any of the earlier words spoken under tension. Officer Briggs finally cleared his throat and shifted his weight slightly on the gravel. The flashing lights behind him reflected across the badge on his chest and across the faded side of the pickup truck. "Mr. Clark," he said carefully, "I appreciate your patience tonight." Jonathan Clark gave a small nod. "Situations like this are not unusual," he replied calmly. Authority carries responsibility, and sometimes responsibility means correcting a moment before it becomes something worse. Briggs absorbed the remark silently. The officer glanced briefly toward Marcus Reed again. Mr. Reed, he said, you mentioned your repair shop is on County Road 22. Marcus nodded. Yes, sir. Just outside town. Briggs looked back toward Jonathan Clark. You said he offered you a ride when your car broke down. Clark nodded once. That is correct. The officer exhaled slowly, his eyes moving once more between the two men. Then I suppose this stop delayed both of you more than it should have. Marcus gave a small shrug from behind the wheel. A few minutes is not the end of the world. Clark smiled faintly at that. Marcus has been very patient tonight. The distant sound of another vehicle drifted along the highway while the patrol lights continued to pulse against the night sky. Officer Briggs looked down briefly at the gravel beneath his boots before raising his eyes again. Mr. Clark, he said, if you still need a ride into town, I can escort the truck the rest of the way. It would probably save you some time. Clark considered the suggestion for a moment before answering. That would be appreciated. Briggs nodded and stepped back toward his patrol car, switching off the bright overhead spotlight that had been aimed toward the truck. The sudden softening of the light made the roadside feel quieter and more natural again. Marcus Reed watched the officer walk back toward his vehicle before turning slightly toward Jonathan Clark. You still good to ride with me? Marcus asked calmly. Clark looked toward him with quiet warmth. If the offer still stands, he replied. Marcus gave a small nod. Of course it does. Officer Briggs returned a moment later after adjusting something inside the patrol car. The flashing lights remained active, but less intense now, no longer casting harsh shadows across the roadside. Briggs stood beside the truck once more and looked toward Marcus. You can pull back onto the road whenever you are ready, he said. Marcus nodded once and adjusted his grip on the steering wheel. The engine rumbled slightly as he prepared to shift the truck into gear. Jonathan Clark stepped back toward the open passenger door and paused for a moment before climbing inside. As he settled into the seat, he looked briefly toward Officer Briggs. Officer, he said calmly, thank you for taking the time to correct the situation tonight. Briggs gave a quiet nod in return. Thank you for your understanding, sir. The passenger door closed with a soft, solid sound. Marcus Reed eased the truck slowly forward as the headlights illuminated the open road ahead. Behind him, the patrol car remained on the shoulder with its lights still flashing. But the moment that had begun with suspicion now moved quietly toward resolution as the worn pickup truck rolled forward into the night, carrying two men whose paths had crossed in a way neither of them had expected. Marcus Reed guided the old pickup truck carefully back onto the highway while the red and blue lights of Officer Daniel Briggs's patrol car slowly faded behind them in the rearview mirror. The road stretched ahead under the soft glow of distant streetlights, and the steady rumble of the truck engine filled the quiet cabin with a familiar, comforting sound. For several miles, neither man spoke. The moment on the roadside had been intense, but now the night air drifting through the slightly open window carried a calmer feeling. Marcus kept both hands on the steering wheel as the truck moved smoothly along the dark highway at a steady pace just below 60 miles per hour. Beside him, Jonathan Clark sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the road ahead with a thoughtful expression. Finally, Clark let out a small breath and turned slightly toward Marcus. You handled that situation with more patience than most people would have, he said. Marcus gave a small shrug without taking his eyes off the road. Getting angry never helps much when someone already thinks they have the whole story figured out, he replied calmly. Clark nodded slowly. The dim dashboard lights reflected softly across the worn interior of the truck. You stopped to help a stranger tonight, he said. You did not know who I was, and you had no reason to pull over. Marcus smiled faintly. My father used to say that if you see someone stuck on the side of the road, you stop if you can help, he answered. That is just how I was raised. Clark leaned back slightly in the seat and looked out the window at the quiet fields passing by in the darkness. That kind of thinking is more valuable to a city than most people realize, he said softly. The truck continued along the highway, for several more minutes before the lights of the town began to appear in the distance. Small buildings and street lamps slowly replaced the open fields as Marcus guided the truck toward the main road that led into the center of town. Clark glanced toward him again. "Marcus," he said, "would you mind stopping by City Hall tomorrow morning?" Marcus looked briefly toward him with a curious expression. "City Hall," he repeated. Clark nodded with a small smile. "I believe someone who runs a repair shop and still takes the time to help strangers might have ideas worth hearing." Marcus let out a quiet laugh. "I just fix engines," he said. Clark shook his head gently. "Sometimes the people who keep things running understand problems better than anyone else," he replied. A few minutes later, Marcus pulled the truck to the curb, outside a well-lit building near the center of town. Clark opened the passenger door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. Before closing the door, he paused and looked back at Marcus. "Thank you again for the ride tonight," he said sincerely. Marcus nodded. "Glad I could help." Clark closed the door and walked toward the entrance of the building, the soft light from inside spilling across the sidewalk as he disappeared through the doorway. Marcus watched for a moment before shifting the truck back into gear and pulling away from the curb. Across town, Officer Daniel Briggs finished completing the report from the roadside stop earlier that night. As he reviewed the document one final time, he paused and stared at the empty line where the reason for the stop had been written. For a long moment, he did not move. Then he slowly rewrote the explanation with a more honest description of what had really happened. Outside the station, the night air remained quiet as the city settled into sleep. And somewhere on the road, a worn pickup truck carried a mechanic home after a long day of work, leaving behind a moment that had quietly reminded 3 different men that dignity, respect, and kindness could appear in places people often overlooked.